The government of South Africa should assist the king in finding a solution to his people. Remember that the father of the current king was a member of the NEC of the ANC. So there is therefore a relationship, long relationship between the Swazis and South Africans. How I wish that Cyril Ramaphosa could facilitate a meeting between the people of Swaziland who are complaining and also complaining against the king, and then the government, the kingdom itself. Host that meeting even here in South Africa in a neutral ground and try and find a solution, amicable solution.
Well, to get a sense of what the latest from Eswatini is, we're now joined via Zoom by Political Analyst Siphetfo Dlamini. He is in Nelspruit in the Mpumalanga Province. Mr. Dlamini, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
A very good evening to you, Nongwane, and your viewers as well.
Well, the so-called second wave of protest is seemingly getting traction, with schools being closed indefinitely, with taxi drivers and owners threatening to take to the streets this coming week, and more protests being planned for the coming week. So what's your understanding of the most probable direction that these protests may take? Are they likely to, to sort of coerce the king to come to the table, to the negotiating table, that is?
Look, I think the situation, first, let me just say, that the situation in Swaziland is taking a new wave of political conflict. Actually, it's an unprecedented situation showing significant signs of a country that is heading towards a war zone. We have seen quite a number of events that have been unfolding, including, of course, the protests that were done by the students. We have recently seen, the public transport operators also saying to themselves, enough is enough. And therefore, all these events could lead to the country becoming even more, unstable, deteriorating. And as to whether or not that has an impact or will have an impact towards the king and the government of Eswatini to eventually come down and sit, it's a different matter altogether. But one can be certain and can be sure that these eventualities and these events that are happening are worth listening to and are worth the ear of the current government of Swaziland.
Well, Nick, the country has suffered what Amnesty International has called, a full frontal assault on human rights as the monarchy so desperately clings on to power. But we've seen very little condemnation from the international community, and it often comes when scores of people have been killed and dozens more injured and hospitalized. Could this be, as a result of the assumption that things will go back to normal? What would you attribute this to?
Look, I think like in many kind of conflicts that are taking place globally, the way in which international community responds to issues of conflict really needs to be revisited. You will understand and remember when SADC, tried to intervene in Swaziland, they were perceived as an institution that had the capability and capacity of bringing forth, peace into the country and setting up a good negotiating table. But of course, most of Eswatini appeared not to have been satisfied with that. In fact, it is more like they said to themselves, SADC did not show up at all. And therefore, the different stages towards any conflict resolution, particularly with the involvement of other bodies outside that particular state, are a contributing factor that leads to the delay of any mechanism or of any a solution that can be brought or even suggested. And therefore, I want to believe that the international community, in as much as it is fully aware of what is happening, the reason why most of the time they find themselves dragging could be mainly attributed to quite a number of things. But more especially, I want to believe that it is just a deliberate kind of exercise that, has been found common in quite a number of countries across the globe in taking quite a long time to, intervene in such states.
And perhaps among the international community, perhaps the country that is most probably expected to take more action and intervene in Swaziland's calls for democratic reforms is South Africa. Now, the Swaziland Solidarity Network has called on the South African government to intervene. I mean, just given the history of the country and the bilateral relations thereof, the South African government has done very little in the past to intervene in Swaziland's calls for democratic reform. So what's your understanding of, why South African government would start acting only now, and what is expected of the South African government to do?
The issue right now really requires some sort of attention. And, Swaziland being a neighbor to South Africa, of course, could somehow mean that South Africa's intervention could be, of course, appreciated. But I want to say this, Siphetfo, that the history of the liberation movements, especially in the southern part of Africa, is one of the main reasons why you find instances where there is also that particular delay that could explain why those conflicts in countries such as Swaziland are not basically solved swiftly. For example, you remember the relationship that the African National Congress had with Swaziland in terms of, or maybe during the time of the struggle, where you find that some of those who were advocating for freedom and liberation in South Africa had to find themselves in Swaziland. Now, of course, that was during the time when the monarchy was there, and who knows what kind of relationships were established to strengthen that, which could basically be explaining the reason why there could be those delays. But amongst other things also, I want to believe that Swaziland and SADC at large, particularly Swaziland, now has the confidence and trust that South Africa is definitely going to be intervening in the issues of Swaziland, particularly because, the current president of South Africa also is the chairperson of the Troika organ, of course, of SADC. And we have had quite a number of encouraging, supporting statements from various alliances in South Africa, especially Blaine Zimanze, who basically stated that the SACP is committed in bringing forth some sort of support towards the democratization of Eswatini.
Now, Nick, the progressive and the opposition movement in the Kingdom of Eswatini have for decades been calling for, dialogue and calls for democratization of the country, and have often been shunned by the monarchy and ultimately the royal family. And what's fueling the tensions even further is His Majesty King Mswati III's response, or the lack thereof, to calls for democratization. And he has on two occasions publicly called the protesters drunkards who are high on marijuana, as Swazis are getting increasingly disenchanted and fed up with the system. Is His Majesty likely to open the door to enter into negotiations, given the history of antagonisms between the monarchy and the progressive movement?
Yeah, look, I think you're correct, Sims, that much of the infuriation and frustration has mainly been caused by, the lack of being given attention, as the people of Swaziland have always been saying. There's been quite a number of efforts that have been tried by those who are advocating for democracy and their leaders, of course, to say, here are we are basically interested in coming up with a resolution to this matter. But again, it does appear that the king does not seem to be, interested in giving them an ear. Hence, there's been quite a number of, instances where the king has referred to those who are advocating for democracy as drunkards and as people who smoke marijuana. And one does not expect that such statements should be going down well easy with Mswati. Instead, that has contributed tremendously towards, infuriating Mswati, having them to be more angry and participating on the streets and burning tires and closing the roads, because they really feel that there isn't any king or any government for that matter. But also, that could also explain the lack of capability and capacities within the current authorities in bringing forth a solution to what is currently happening. So it is no surprise what is happening currently. People have also turned out to apply vigilantism by taking, the law into their own hands. But I must say also that simply there is hope, in eventually having the country to get back to its a stable situation as it was. However, that will only happen if the country finds itself reaching, significant points leading towards democratization.
And speaking of hope, Nick, I mean, it's quite noteworthy the amount of unity that has been observed amongst, Swazi people in its, in its calls for the democratization of the country. And so many Swazi people are now coming together to condemn the country's system. But then to get a sense that the calls for democratization are synchronized, because, some people are of the view that the tensions are as a result of calls for the release of the pro-democracy members of parliament who've been incarcerated, and some are calling for, a prime minister who is directly elected by the people, and some are calling for the repeal of the so-called draconic 1973 law that bans political party activity in Swaziland. Do you get a sense then that all these calls are synchronized? Do people really understand what is it that they want?
Yeah, one of the main important things that has made, this which is happening in Swaziland to be unique and different, compared to what has been happening in the past, has been the quality of the leaders that are basically, pushing, the democratization of Eswatini.
Yes.
And for some reason, I think the current authorities have never, at some point, come across such a united kind of leaders. These are people whom I can describe as, leaders that have unleashed their untapped leadership qualities. They are determined individuals, highly influential, and of course, they are characterized by a strong unity of purpose. And this in turn, of course, strengthens the relationship, not only amongst themselves, but, between those who are led and the leaders themselves. You will understand what happens if that takes place, because that simply explains the shift of power. Once people start saying, we are not going to be listening to the authorities, neither are we going to be interested in listening to the king, but we will only stop that which we are doing, which is protesting and other things, of course, only and only when our leaders basically speak. So I think that is the situation basically right now. So I'm not seeing the government heeding to this call now. If that will happen, we are all hoping that it will not be something late. You will know, as impure, that they say, the bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists. So it will be quite important, of course, for the government to put aside the idea of avoiding coming up with solutions and instead just, bring solutions, because that has been one of the things, of course, that the Swazi people have realized, that the government is basically, avoiding bringing solutions. I'll make an example, of course, with, the shutting down of schools. For me, really, I want to believe that will not have much of an effect in terms of curbing that which is currently happening, the protest, of course, because these youths, remember that students are the youths, of course, they are likely to reorganize themselves in different setup as well, and, contribute towards adding more numbers in various, aspects. And therefore, I really think that, the government has a huge responsibility in beefing up those who are capable in bringing forth conflict resolutions within themselves, but most importantly, wishing to give the citizens an ear going forward.
And it's absolutely diabolical that the protesting students have been threatened with scholarships being, declined in the future as they call for democratic reforms. Nick Dlamini, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Noman, and your viewers.
All right, thank you. That was political analyst Nick Dlamini just sharing with us his thoughts on developments coming out of Eswatini.